Joining us from Oxford University, Judy's the director of the Rees Centre for Research in Fostering and Education. Those of you here from education and social work will of course know that Judy Sebba was here with us before she left and joined Oxford. So we're delighted to welcome her back, and she's going to talk to us about another educational initiative here in the UK. So that's UNICEF's UK Right Respecting Schools Initiative and Evaluation. And it's my understanding that the initiative itself has gained quite a lot of popularity across the world. So over to you, Judy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lovely to be here, and lovely to see old friends and new faces as well. And just to give you a very small amount of background, when I was here in education social work, we had a series of contracts with UNICEF UK, myself and Carol Robinson. Carol Robinson is now at Brighton University, and the first one was to evaluate this scheme. I'll tell you a bit more about what it's about in a moment. The second one was to look at some more schools just on one-off visits. And the third one was to actually generate a document of best practice. And since she's just walked in the room, I say we both, Carol and I, were very inspired by Perpetua's work on children's participation, and also by Michael Fielding, who we were both working with at the time, and along with Perpetua. And I'm delighted that Perpetua has now taken this opportunity to give her work some academic clout, and we'll see whether that increases or decreases its impact. But the participation book that she published with the DFE, the Department for Education, has been extremely widely used. So I've had a kind of change of career since I was here. I wasn't particularly looking for another job, but an opportunity came up to run a research centre, and it's always very difficult, if you love research, to say no to a full-time research job. And not that I don't like teaching, I do, but also I have a really bad hearing problem, so the teaching has become increasingly difficult. And the job is really about looked after children, which I didn't particularly have a strong background in. The reason I went to run this centre was that the sponsors, who are actually an independent group of fostering companies, wanted to look very carefully at the beginning at the relationship between research policy and practice. So it's very much about improving their services and other people's services by drawing on research findings, both existing findings and new ones. So we do lots of reviews of things. So I don't know if we've got any, what I might call proper social workers here, have we? Have we got any social workers here? Yes, okay. So our website is full of documents about fostering research, about how you recruit foster carers and how you train them and all that stuff. But basically, that's what we've been doing. We're now moving into, we are attached to Oxford Education Department, University Education Department, and we're moving into work which looks at that interface more closely between social care and education. And we have a big Nuffield grant which is looking at what's called the National Pupil Data Set, which some of you in education will know about already, has all the data on all children in the system about their education data, and linking that to the children looked after data, which is returned by the local authorities every year, and to find out things such as how does the number of placements you have affect your educational progress, those kind of questions. And the Department for Education have done a little bit of work on that. All I want to say about that work is that although I haven't done any work on specifically the rights respecting schools work or rights in general since taking on this new role in 2012, I'm very struck by the number of times that the issue of the UN Convention in relation to looked after children arises in the work, and in particular in relation to the rights to family life, which in most cases the children that we're focusing on have never had, actually, because what they were experiencing in their families prior to coming into care was not what you and I would describe as a family life. So I think the right to family life is very important, and also Article 12, which you come back to, about their engagement in decision making about their own lives and so on, absolutely critical. And we ran a conference a couple of weeks ago which we hosted with the Oxfordshire virtual school, which is the team of people in the local authority who are responsible. It's not a school, it's not a building, but they're responsible for the progress of looked after children in schools. And we ran the national conference for all the virtual school head teachers from all over the country, and we had a group of young people speaking, care leavers, care experienced young people in their early 20s, speaking about what had helped or hindered their education. And number two, by the way, was fragmentation of services, which won't surprise you. Number one was about people not listening to them. That was number one. That was the most. So when people listened, things went well. When people ignored them, and Rees's work on exclusion, lots of other people will have encountered this in the context of their other research. When they weren't listened to, things went badly wrong. Okay, so the first, why was UNICEF interested in this at all, and why in the UK? And you'd probably be familiar with this UNICEF report, which came out in 2000, was published in 2007. I wonder whether, are most of you familiar with this, probably? I wonder whether you recall which of the 6 scales UK did not come bottom in. There was only one. So we didn't come bottom in. Can you remember which one it was? It relates to my, what was it?
Was it risky behaviours? Risky behaviours on 5?
Risky behaviours? Any other votes?
No, it's health and safety.
Health and safety. This Melissa, mirrors my experience in Sussex University. Because in 10 years I was required 3 times to attend compulsory courses on health and safety. I was never required to attend a compulsory course on how to teach or how to research. Compulsory. 3 times health and safety. We are, as a community, I think, obsessed with health and safety. I wasn't surprised that that was the one we didn't come bottom in. It is extremely worrying that we did so badly on the other ones here. And I think UNICEF took this very seriously, and I'm not sure what would happen if we repeated this. I don't think it would be a great deal better now. It might be a bit different. So the UNICEF Rights Respecting Schools Award, which had already started then actually, seeks to put the convention at the heart of the school's culture. And I think that's important to say that. This isn't an initiative. This isn't about bringing in somebody to do something different or a programme or anything like that. This is about looking, and this is where it fits in beautifully with Michael Fielding's work, it's about looking at the underlying values in the school system. And in fact, in many places, it has extended beyond the school system into the local community in one way or another. So it is about the values that the convention, the interpretation of the convention in terms of values of ways of living. And so a rights respecting school is a community where those rights are learned, taught, practiced, respected, protected and promoted. It's not about, as I say, a separate programme, right, we all do. And I think it has been unfortunate that the Citizenship and PSHE curriculum has consistently been interpreted, well, we've had periods where it's been statutory in some parts of schooling and not in other parts, or it's been statutory or it hasn't been statutory, or it's going to be done like this or like that. Nevertheless, it's remained to be seen by schools and the wider community as a bolt-on, as a separate activity. And really that's been its downfall, in my view. That's been a problem all the way through, because we need this stuff not to be about something that's taught separately. We need people to understand that it affects everything from the moment we wake up in the morning. Okay, so can you read that all right at the back? Yeah, okay. So the UNICEF Rights Respecting Schools have 4 fundamental standards, which are then interpreted into lots and lots of little sort of checklisty type items, and illustrated by examples and all the rest of it, typical of any kind of scheme that you might expect to find. The first is that those values underpin leadership and management. And it is interesting, they start with leadership and management. The view is always that unless the leaders and managers in the school system are completely committed to this, it's a waste of time. We don't see many examples of it growing from the bottom up. Relating to your previous talk, about whether things are top-down or bottom-up. I think that's an important issue here. And what we do sometimes see is that a rights-respecting school where the head or senior managers leave, get promoted, go somewhere else, or get ill or whatever, the school manages, if it's really embedded, to maintain that way of working, even when somebody new comes in. It's very difficult for the new person, if they're not committed to this, to cope with what they then find, because the system tends to be rather different to that which is normally encountered in the average school. I should have said at the beginning that Frances Besley, who's in charge of this programme at UNICEF, updated me the day before yesterday. She says 12% of UK schools are now involved in this. That's 3,250 schools. They are trying, she noted that this was a European conference, they are trying to promote it in other European countries. I've had, over the last 5 years, meetings with people from Spain and Italy, and also a research proposal from, where is it, House University, is that Denmark? Yep, yeah. Denmark, right, okay. So from Denmark, which was to run a randomised control trial on rights respecting schools. I'm not convinced that would be very easy to do, but nevertheless, they put in a massive grant application. We'll find out at some stage whether they got it. So the second one is that the whole community learns about the convention. One of the points of tension between myself and UNICEF has been about the use of the language of the convention. And I'd be interested, some of you working in areas connected with this, what you think about that. I'm sure language is important because it reflects our values, and we debate this endlessly in all sorts of other areas of work, but I'm not sure it necessarily means that if you don't use the language, you're not doing it. And that was what I found. I found examples of people doing things that were consistent with the convention, but not necessarily using the language. In fact, not using any particular language. It wasn't that they'd be using anti-convention language, they just weren't. And this was a bit of a bone of contention because UNICEF were very keen that the language of the articles and so on are sometimes, in my view, almost learned in a kind of parrot fashion. So that's what I was trying to avoid, that kind of parroting of it. I think it's much more likely that what you see is the opposite, which is people using the language and not doing it. Yeah? And that applies to lots of areas of life again. And that seems to me to be a bigger problem. Okay. And most importantly, and by far the most challenging, is this standard D, children being empowered to become active citizens and learners. I'm going to say much more about that, so I won't dwell on it now. Okay, so what Carol and I did in the first part, which was 2007-2010, was to follow 12 schools across 5 local authorities in England. 8 of them were primary schools, and only 2 mainstream special schools. One area had a middle school system and so on. And it is true that predominantly at the moment in the UNICEF programme there are more primary schools involved, even proportionate to the number of primary schools in England, and that generally the primary schools have made more progress. But there are a small group of secondary schools that have made a great deal of progress. And what is really interesting is when you get a primary school in an area where the secondary school isn't doing it, and I'll come back to that. This is not involved at all. By the end of the evaluation, 9 of these schools had achieved level 2, which is the more advanced level of, it is like a checklist and like an award scheme and all that. But nevertheless, you still aren't meant to separate it out in terms of saying, right, now we're going to do our rights respecting lesson. And we collected documentation, we undertook interviews. By far the most entertaining part of this project was hanging around in playgrounds. And that was really an eye-opener. And I think you did some of that in your project, didn't you, in your assessment? Did you do in your Scottish assessment work?
I mean, I was doing...
hanging about in playgrounds. But hanging about in playgrounds was brilliant because the role, what I was trying to capture was the kind of bullying type conflicts, how do they mediate conflict and so on. And you see plenty of that in playgrounds. And the rights respecting schools that were well established were definitely different in playgrounds, and I'll come back to that. And it was, but what was really interesting is, because of the way the rights respecting works, they couldn't really ignore me, because that would have been exclusion of some sort. So of course, every now and again I was required to join in a skipping game, you know, play dens or whatever it happened to be. And in the secondary school, I'm not exactly sure what I was being invited to participate in, but it was really interesting that, of course, they couldn't just ignore me, because you can't have that concept if you don't let anybody get left out. So why is this person lurking by the kind of friend in this way? So that was really interesting. And it was basically to assess the impact of the scheme on young people and on the schools. And part of this was to look at this tension which we hear about time and time again. Oh, if we do citizenship, if we do PSHE or whatever we want to call it now. I don't know what is it called? It's got another name now. Anyway, they basically, whatever, we're doing that, we're doing it at the expense of raising standards. Yeah, that it will somehow conflict, and this is what I think what the current government would have us believe. We'll come back to whether that actually happens. There was no doubt that for the majority of the schools, by no means all, they were the underlying values that the convention provide allowed them to develop a guide for life that was based on those values. That's what it was about. A guide to life. It wasn't about everything that only happened in the school. It was about what they did on the weekends. It was about what happened out of school. They constantly brought examples of what was going on out of school into school, and they constantly related it to things that they were doing outside of school, community, in the community, and so on. So these are just some very positive. It wasn't all positive. I do inevitably have become a bit of a promoter of this scheme, because I do think it's a real key to getting more inclusion, and I do think the evidence is there of that, irrespective of the mode of whether people manage to raise standards at the same time as, or not. And so, you know, I think as soon as you've got very complicated, especially for those of you without a background in education, but a lot of the structural aspects of our current system in education actually promote kind of selectivity of one sort or another. And the problem is this is not going to work in a selective school, because by definition it is aimed at bringing a better understanding of diversity about. So if you've got a highly selective population, you can only make so much progress, I think. And that might be something we want to talk about. These are some other comments which I think have illustrate some more specific points. So the first one, which I want to come back to, is you can take the rights anywhere. That's important, because when we did find, Carol and I, some evidence, not a huge amount, but some evidence in a handful of schools, probably 2 or 3 schools, I think, that rights were being used as, that the convention was being used as a potential punishment tool. So, you know, you have your right taken away if you do this or whatever it happens to be. And the notion of universality of rights was not really well understood in some places. And UNICEF really took that on board and have reported on that specific point. So that's why I put the first one in. We did get some really wonderful comments from parents and midday supervisors, both positive and negative. You know, again, Perpetua will know from her work and Rebecca from her work, not all people think children should have greater voice than they do have. Some people think, thank you very much, they have too much voice already. And perhaps just to go to the last one for a moment, the poor parent who told us with great pride, I have to say, with great pride, that her 4-year-old had given her a lecture in front of the entire population of Tesco's about fair trade, and that she was buying the wrong, I think it was bananas, I can't remember, was, I think, really illustrative of parents grappling themselves with this challenge, and in most cases, not all cases, but in most cases, being positively challenged and constructively challenged by their own children. A lot of quotes about fighting and less bullying. The My Rights but Other Responsibilities is one, again, that we had to take up with UNICEF. There was a bit of a tendency to try and match one right to one responsibility, as if there was a perfect one-to-one correspondence. And that was something which they had to then address in subsequent material. I'm sorry that these two children look so miserable. I don't think they really were, but I haven't got a better example of this. I'm trying to illustrate here a knowledge and understanding of the convention. So in this case, this was about we have the right to an identity, and there was a lot of development of particular rights and the understanding of those rights. And in most cases, I mean, occasionally, I would come away thinking the teacher hasn't understood this and is actually giving the wrong message, almost the opposite message to that intended. But mostly it was extremely good. If there's one thing that stands out, it's the relationships. And I got a tremendously excited phone call in about year 2 or 3 of this evaluation from an ex-colleague from Manchester University, which is where I started my degree. In fact, he was at Cambridge, actually, with colleagues and myself. And Mel Ainscoe, who's a special ed person, kind of inclusive education person from Manchester, who was doing some work on inclusion in the North East. And he came out of the school to ring me on a mobile and say, I've just been in one of your schools. I had no idea what he meant. I said, what are you going on about? Really excited. He said, the children are so good at negotiating. It had to be a UNICEF rights respected school. So I asked ahead and they said, yeah, we've been doing it for 3 or 4 years, you know. And he said, I knew straight away. He said, I was there all morning, nobody shouted. There was no shouting, no adult shouting about children, but certainly no adult shouting, plenty of negotiation. And I think that's the thing you notice first of all, is even very young children saying, you know, I think you've just taken my pencil. Could you have it back? You know, that is the biggest difference. It is the one thing that really stands out, because, and that's what the pupils said, time and time again, primary, secondary, all age, even special school pupils said, less fighting, less, I feel safer, really important in terms of the convention, I feel safer. Okay. And a very strong sense of belonging, which is interesting in my current job. The sense of belonging is what most people who looked after most people who have care experience spend a great deal of emotional energy seeking out a sense of belonging. And we have 3 potential doctoral students for next year. One, interestingly, is doing international human rights at the moment at Masters in Oxford, but used to be the rights director for a minister in Romania. And she wants to look at comparison of Romania and other countries in terms of care provision, but in particular in relation to the rights and how far, for example, you know, very obvious things like inter-country adoption and stuff where rights are potentially massively compromised. And I think that one of the other doctoral applicants, who is a care experienced young person, her sense of belonging has been seriously marginalised by her experience. And it came home to me because she had to fill out the college application form, and the college application form asked for next of kin. And she rang me and she said, I haven't got a next of kin. What shall I put? So now the Rees Centre is their next of kin. It's an interesting dilemma for somebody now. She has no relatives. She's completely on her own in that sense. And that, for somebody like me who comes from a massive family, I just cannot imagine not having a next of kin. I don't know whether any of you, are in that situation, but it just seemed an extraordinary experience to be facing. Okay. I don't think you'll be able to read this, but it's to illustrate children's positive. Each one of these is illustrating one of the standards, okay? So this is a year 6 group in Dorset who were looking at the fact that the US and Somalia had not signed up to the convention, And you know, this kind of comment, well, America's huge, what's their problem? So they decided to write to Obama. This was just when Obama just got elected. Dear President, I'm writing to persuade you to sign the contract, and congratulations on winning the President of the USA. I'm just going to read you out a couple of sentences here. You have children of your own and would not like it if they were put in prison, would you? May I remind you that in the children's rights it says that children should not be put into prison under the age of 18. This is because you become an adult. I know you have a lot to do at the moment, including trying to close down a terrible prison, but it would be wonderful if you could just sign the contract. They did get a reply. I'm not sure it was directly from Obama, and it wasn't terribly giving much commitment. But anyway, this is actually a school that wasn't in the evaluation study, but which we went to visit as an example of good practice afterwards. And it's a primary school, tiny primary school on the coast of Scotland, where Fife is like a local authority. If you're familiar with Scotland. Anybody else familiar with Scotland? Okay, so in Scotland, you know, that Fife would be the equivalent of a local authority. In Fife, they have a rights officer for the whole council, children's rights officer, and children's rights are promoted throughout the services. So it's just not just the schools that do it. And this was probably one of the most exciting schools I saw, very small school, where the children frankly ran the school, but with the head support. The children did teaching on human rights. The children made all the decisions about the school, but within the constraints of the budget, and so on. They made they were involved in all staff appointments. They were involved in feeding back on the quality of teaching, which I think those kind of three areas, governance, evaluating teaching and learning, and staff appointments, are pretty good dipsticks as to what's going on in terms of children's decision making. And they have in particular had this very interesting scheme, which was Newswatch. So there's the Newswatch, where they tracked items of news that they felt were examples of denying of children's rights. And I'm really sorry that you can't see these, but they showed a remarkable, as well as being excellent pieces of writing for that age group of children, a remarkable level of understanding of major global issues. And I'll have the original examples if people want to see. And I mentioned before that perhaps one of the most, one of the strongest features of these schools is the inclusivity and diversity. And it shows up in lots of ways, but there are obviously some quite extreme examples of this. In one of the schools I went into, there was a man a teacher in a wheelchair who was teaching PE from a wheelchair, no legs, and the children completely took it in their stride. They were obviously used to this way of working. When I talked to them about how they thought the school coped with different kinds of people, this chap was never mentioned. I thought that was really interesting. And I don't mean they don't notice him as a person, because they clearly related to him very well, but they don't notice any longer that he happens to be in a wheelchair. So there was a much greater level of tolerance and of diversity. Of course, I should say, some of these schools, and Bridport would be one of them, are in areas where they don't, for example, from an ethnicity point of view, have a big diverse population, and that's an issue for them, trying to get children to understand different groups of people, different religions and so on, when they have a very homogenous population, is actually quite a challenge. So this was a school where all of the three things I just mentioned were illustrated. Children were involved. They didn't make staff decisions on their own, but they did. They were involved in staff decisions, including in the third year the appointment of a new head teacher, and the previous one retired. They were involved in observing lessons and giving feedback, and they were involved in school governance. The school council participated in the school governors' meetings, and they gave regular feedback they also were involved in other things like playground mediation and so on. Right, now this will be very difficult to read, but this is an example from them of their feedback on teaching. So, what you have down here is some criteria, like teaching assistants are well used, which were generated by the senior managers and the pupils together. And then what you have here were the children's comments on against those. And because the writing was a little tricky to follow, I tried to type them out, and now it's even more tricky to follow. You can they put here the TAs helping children with work, the TAs put to use, i.e. they're actually involved in doing something, and they're not just hanging about, and they're involved with the children. So you can see the kinds of ways in which they were giving feedback. This is just another example of some work here in relation to a school which used regular democratic meetings in order to get the views from different children, but also here, this was also about expression, getting them to express their views, and so they talked about current affairs issues as well, to try and get people more confident in speaking out. I think I'm nearly at the end. Yeah. Okay. So was it in conflict with what you might call, you might want to call government obsessions, or parent obsessions, or whatever, or school obsessions, because they feel under pressure from parents and the government about attainment, exclusion, etc. And in general, it would be very difficult to say the schools that are pursuing this definitely do better for all children. We don't have that kind of evidence. Even now, I check that out with UNICEF. One thing we do have is definite improvement in relation to attendance and exclusions for those schools in general. And what I think is particularly interesting is the ones who had the most, the ones in the poorest areas who had the most children of lower socioeconomic status at intake actually had made the most progress. And that was interesting because there was an assumption that those would be the schools where they would do lots of this wonderful stuff about rights, but their standards would stay down. And actually it seemed to have a beneficial, if you like, I mean, I'm suggesting, this is me here being, really just, if you like, a theory which I'd love to test out, which is that it mediates somehow the influence of poor socio-economic circumstances. Now, I have now since seen that in other research, and I think I've included it. If I just, sorry, if I just, yeah, just go on to that in a moment. This is an evaluation. One of the local authorities in England that has a lot of schools doing RRSA is Hampshire. They have over 400 schools doing rights respecting work. And Cavell and colleagues from Canada have been evaluating this because they were involved in it years ago, and they've been following 3 schools in particular, and you'll see there that they are also arguing for a kind of mediation of socially disadvantaged children. Okay, so I think the jury's out on that really, and it's something I'd love to look at in, more closely. What I found right at the end of this work, and just when I was knew I was going to be changing jobs, is that 1 or 2 of these schools do particularly well with children who are in care. Of course, the numbers are so small to show statistically how that works was impossible. Right. So we had a number of issues which we raised with UNICEF, which we thought needed to be addressed. The first one was this one-to-one correspondence, the notion that for every right you have a responsibility, and that they're sort of matched up like a jigsaw, and that, you know, each time you mention one, you've got to mention the other in that kind of corresponding way. And they reiterated the notion of unconditional rights and learned responsibilities in their materials following this, and they targeted this problem. And according to Francis, it's now got better, but I don't have any evidence one way or the other. The second one was, and it was interesting because this came up in your talk about the tension about language use. was the tension between school and home for some children. This wasn't big numbers, but there were definitely some children who felt that the way they were being, the way the discussion was going at school was in direct opposition with what they were doing at home and what they were being told to do at home, and that this was a problem. And I was reminded of the primary school in Southampton that I went to visit years ago, about 10 years ago, that were doing emotional literacy at the time. And when we said to the head, why have you chosen to do this programme? She said, so the parents stop beating each other up in the car park on the parents' evening. Nothing to do with the kids. And that was a bit scary because, although it was interesting obviously, but it was a bit scary because it does suggest, you know, it's illustrative if you like anyway, of this kind of problem where the teacher might find that they're then up against a cultural dispute if you like. And that's just an example, and I think we'd all be clear that it's not an acceptable example. Nevertheless, what is the teacher to say in that situation? Do they say, well, your dad's wrong? Do they say, you know, how do they actually get around to moving that child onto a different position with respect to understanding racism? So, and there are lots of people working in that field who know a lot more about it than I do. There was a difficulty, as I mentioned before, with some midday supervisors, and people who are part-time in that kind of school and not getting the immersion into the culture that your average pupil or teacher is getting day in, day out. This is the way we live in this community. And so for that person who's kind of parachuting in at lunchtime to do the dinners and then going off somewhere else, maybe that's not the dominant culture in their lives, and so it just takes a little bit longer. And we found one or two of them who were seriously confused about what it was all about. So I think schools, as a result of that, and UNICEF in particular, have made a very big issue about really making sure that everybody connected with the school knows what's going on and why, the justification for it. And then we did get some tokenistic fundraising, which I'm sure you've all encountered in different ways, but children saying, we're collecting money for poor people in Africa. They're all poor, you know, in Africa. They walk around with buckets and water on their head, or whatever. You know, the stereotypes which have been picked up, which was sometimes reflected in the fundraising, and which for Carol and I created a discomfort with whether the child actually understood what was underlying all of this, or was just feeling better about themselves. You know, it's that whole problem about your relationship with charity. You feel better about yourself because you've done something, even if there's something you've done is actually not necessarily the right thing to do, or you haven't fully understood its implications. And so we had quite a lot of discussion with UNICEF over this. And the last one, which was really interesting, was that in Dorset, the primary schools who had been doing this very vociferously for a number of years, then found that when their children moved on to the secondary school, the first year the secondary school would have a majority of children who'd been through rights respecting primary schools and who just wouldn't put up with what they met in the secondary school. And it was brilliant. They just said, oh, we don't do things like that. That's not how we work. We're going to tell you what your teaching's like. That was an experience. And I interviewed some secondary school teachers who were flabbergasted, but actually quite impressed. And it did act as a stimulus to the secondary schools to take it on board. So I think they have acted on some of this stuff. There was also this business about withdrawing a right as a punishment. We had two schools who were obsessed with this. And you know, the notion of the unconditionality, just, we couldn't get it across. There was a small amount of evidence that this is not in conflict with Ofsted inspection, and we keep an eye on that. It depends a bit on which inspectors they get. This is interesting because this is actually a test paper from a Year 6 child in the primary school, a different primary school, one that wasn't involved in the study, and they were asked to write about their charity, a short speech to persuade your class to support your choice of charity. So the school had no say in the setting of the questions, and that would be right, they would have come from somewhere else. But they did find that their rights respecting work were reflected in the answers that they got. So this is just an example of that. Children have rights, and some of the children there don't get them. So we're talking about collecting money for children's education. And in the House of Lords in 2009, the work of the rights respecting schools, and in fact Sussex University came up. I wish I could say this led to a major change in education policy. Sadly, we're still waiting for that. I think it's because in this current climate, you would not expect this kind of programme to have much appeal in this government's agenda, which is very sad. Having said that, it's a bit of a miracle they've managed to increase the number of schools who are involved in it. And I think if we kept going on this, this is not in conflict with achievement. We might be doing better. So a couple of comments from other writers on this. I think this is important. Laura Lundy, who some of you will know, in Belfast, is it called the Children's Rights Research Centre? I think so. Yeah. And they have been engaging in this, not specifically in UNICEF, but in this kind of work for some time. And she's basically, I think this is a plea for not being tokenistic about it and being very careful that people actually understand all of these things are necessary requirements. I think this is a really good bad time for me to have raised this, but I presume that people can have the slides afterwards. Yes, see them all right in the way a bit. But it's fine with me if people have the slides. And Ruth Leach, who actually works in the same centre, talking about the need to understand that it redefines power relationships. It's an obvious point, it's a point which you've made many times, which Michael Fidian made many times, but in terms of actually understanding that and taking that on board, that's still quite a challenge for some schools. So, that comes from one of the Hampshire schools where they've been working in this way for a very long time, and I want to finish with that. And that is the child's own language, so I'm not going to get into a debate about whether that's the right language or the wrong language. I have some copies of the report here, and if anybody else wants it electronically or in hard copy, we've got plenty. So,
Thank you very much.
Almost, not quite.
Thank you, Judy.